Hi, everybody. I am Allison Zmuda, and I'm so excited to be joined by Michelle Hughes, who is our guest featured consultant of having her continue to engage not just with connection with habits of mind, which we'll be talking towards.
I think that we're losing you, Allison. We lost you.
Yeah.
So Michelle is great. I'm Bena Kallick, and this is Michelle Hughes, and we're waiting for Allison to return.
Fantastic. And clearly my Wi-Fi is a little bit spotty, but hopefully will continue to be behaving as we continue to move through our conversation today. And the power of curriculum storyboards has been something that Heidi Hayes Jacobs and I have been so truly blessed by in terms of the reception over the past year and a half since the book has first come out. And one of the important pieces is that as we continue to spread the idea of storyboards, there have been multiple workshops that have gone on over the course of the past 2 years. And Michelle had an opportunity to attend one of those workshops. So Michelle, can we start by talking about what actually were you drawn to when you attended the workshop? I believe it was in June of, I think it was 2 years ago, correct?
Yeah, it was. It was 2 summers ago. I was drawn first, of course, by the two of you and spending time with you. But I was also primarily storyboards have been a big teaching tool for me for years. In literature, in history, let's storyboard how the Civil War played out. So we storyboarded all the time, and we did that because what it does is it really pushes you to crystallize the most important pieces of what it is you're trying to convey. And I was so fascinated by the idea of doing this with curriculum. So as a new founder of a consultancy, I was really interested in how I could utilize that with teachers. But I learned so much. And one of the things that I did during the workshop was to storyboard my own practice.
Yeah. And so before we dive into the example that you started describing, I just want to make sure that for folks that are listening to us live, or they're going to look back on this as a recorded session, the opportunity to understand what the heck a curriculum storyboard is. And so the idea, as Michelle was starting to lean into, is that a curriculum storyboard is creating this kind of advanced organizer, not just for the teacher, but primarily written in language that's accessible for students and families. So that advanced organizer provides a level of, it's a route, a navigation, as you, Michelle, started to play around with the idea of being on a boat, whether you're on a river or you're on an ocean, but the opportunity of starting to think about the idea of landmarks along the way, where the journey itself may actually be less predictable, but the opportunity to continue to stop at the next landmark and begin to reflect back on what's the learning so far, where we're headed next, and how that is part of the continued through line of the learning experience, so that I can continue to appreciate the opportunities, the actions, and the skills and expertise that I gathered along the way. And curriculum storyboards, again, from a preschool through 12th grade perspective, it can very much be connected and aligned to things like the vision or the portrait of a graduate, or the idea of external standards, whether it's from the state level, provincial level, or national level, or connection to habits of mind. So that to me is the territory of what a curriculum storyboard is, what its purpose is, so that it is something that is a planning tool, but an active way of making sense, both from a classroom teacher's perspective as well as from a learner's perspective. Bena, do you want to add anything?
No, no, I just think it's kind of interesting to also see the way Michelle expanded that fundamental idea, because curriculum, although we think of that, of course, as what's central to what we're doing with our students in the school, the pathways they're taking, there are also the ancillary pathways that make it possible. For example, professional development, for example, ways that we coach together. So I think that this expanding the idea to say curriculum is the center, but what are some of the ancillary supports that make that curriculum actually more operational, more visionary, more speaking to the parents and the communities? So that's why I think that I was particularly excited about what she was doing with Habits of Mind.
Yeah.
Because that's certainly one of the questions, which is how do we make this, which is central to curriculum, become something that's embedded, rather than thinking of it as we have that going on, but it goes on in a separate space. So Michelle has been very creative, as she is, in making this a very inventive space.
Yes. So when we are about to see Michelle's first example, again, just trying to ground what a curriculum storyboard looks like as a front-facing piece before you're looking at the details of her particular example. So the first idea of a storyboard is that it has a very clear, concise unit title that is sort of giving a sort of frame of reference for the focus and the other details of the curriculum storyboard design. And again, we'll see how Michelle started to imagine that in her own work. Second is an image, the idea of an image that is drawing the reader in, but it's also something that continues to captivate. So again, the image of the eye, for example, I found it about a year and a half ago, and it's still something that I am intrigued by every time I look at it. So it's something that's not just a quick window dressing on top. It has to have some kind of allure and make a connection to the last part, which is the focus of the story. And again, as Michelle already started to allude to, the opportunity that the focus is not a laundry list of information, which typically it starts that way as we start to do our initial draft. We really have to step back and think about what is centrally important and how can we do that in a way that continues to draw the reader in, provide the reader the significant amount of information that they may need, but also get them energized about the opportunity of what they are going to be able to do with what they're learning. So that to me is sort of the territory of the storyboard components. So hopefully that comes with a little bit of grounding. And based on what I just described, Michelle, when it comes to the core components, any other ideas that you had, whether it's adding more detail to that or potentially thinking about what other areas you also started to include to round out the storyboard?
Well, I think one of the things that that you all did such a great job in conveying to us at the workshop was to really understand who your audience is. And so when I was writing the my professional storyboard, which is geared towards professional developers, school leaders, teachers, I was thinking about what their priorities are, what they're thinking about. And I was attempting to use language that connected to that. And as a writer of the playbook for Habits of Mind, I was really thinking about the teacher and how were they going to decide among the 16 habits of mind, which habits really worked for their students. And so we were thinking developmentally in that way. But it was also the connections between things that was so important, so that the storyboard hangs together as a concept, even though there are these different components.
So
one
I
of
think
the
it's
things that you're
go ahead.
talking about that are really so prominent in developing a storyboard, Michelle, and I think that that's really so interesting the way you were able to kind of think about that. Whenever we do any curriculum writing, whether it be for any purpose, we have to first ask our question, who's the audience? So the way you started by saying, okay, who is going to read this? That's what I heard you say first. That's the way you thought about it. And then the second was, because you were interested in who was going to read it, you started to ask the question, how can I make this a language that they will understand? So that's the second question that you were raising. And then the third question that you started to raise was, well, if I'm going to be writing this in this way, what connections can they make? And, even when you talked about it in terms of developmental, it's always developmental, whether I'm a first grade teacher or whether I'm doing this for, life is always about some consideration of what's the developmental status of the people that I'm talking with.
Yeah.
So you really took the elements of what the focus of the storyboard would be, and then you translated it into practical terms for yourself.
And there's that iterative process back and forth of what do I mean and who am I speaking with and what's the focus and how are they all connected? It's that it's like a loop in a way as you develop a storyboard, which I've found really fun and fascinating to do.
Well, I mean, I think the other interesting part of this too, Michelle, is that from a storyboard designer, just like you, sometimes I actually have to clarify what I'm trying to communicate in the first place. So the notion first is that from a designer's point of view, before we can think about it as an outward facing communication experience, it's sort of like, how am I sort of laying these pieces out? And in what ways does that actually shift and change my own thinking about the course design or the order of information or how to continue to go after streamlining, what to cut out and scale back on, what to move for another professional development experience, that kind of thing.
It reminds me of, I think it was William Wordsworth who wrote, I would have written you a short note, but I didn't have time, so here's a long one. I think that thing of, beginning with everything and then really parsing out what's really most important, what's the essence here. That's a great discipline for the storyboard writer themselves.
That's right.
So that you bring that in wherever you're doing your work.
Well, I think it's helpful to look at the first concrete example. And Michelle, can you spend a little bit of time walking us through this example? And again, anybody that is joining us live, if you want to say hi to Michelle, or you want to ask a question or offer a comment or two on this storyboard, this is the first example on a learning arts professional development series.
Allison, can you make the storyboard larger and give Michelle a little? That's better. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Bena. So I was interested in how to bring authentic learning into my practice. In what ways do I want to support teachers in introducing and bringing authentic learning into the classroom in a way that is possible in a time where there are so many mandates and so on and so forth. And so I chose 4 areas because I thought, first of all, they cross developmental bounds, but they also are big ideas. And so the big ideas of the power of writing was the very first thing I thought of because I'm a writer and I taught writing, and I wanted to re-energize the idea that children have the imagination and the knowledge to write effectively, and that there's a process by which we can do that that's simplified. And so the power of writing is the planning, the organization, the writing, the editing, and the revision of writing. And that brought me to advisories, because there is so much journaling and so much writing in advisories. And advisories are a really important part of middle school education and high school education. And I think that they have sort of lost their primacy in many ways, but there are simple ways of interjecting advisory and advisory activities into the middle school day. And that led me to think about the different ways that kids learn. And I was an inclusion teacher for a million years. And so I was thinking about how, in everything we do, how we differentiate and encourage independence. Because I think sometimes we forget that part, how important it is for kids to develop independence and how to do that. And finally, then, constructionist learning, which is really about building and making and doing, taking your ideas and bringing them to life. And so all of this is connected by the child's imagination, capabilities, capacities, imagination, the things that they can do given the materials, the opportunities, and so on and so forth. So that bound them together into the title Classroom Journeys, and the essential question: how do we create learning environments which inspire student engagement, interest, and personal growth?
So
And
who were you thinking about when you asked that question, Michelle?
I was thinking about curriculum coordinators. I was thinking about assistant superintendents for instruction. I was thinking about teaching and learning coordinators. I was thinking about people who are holding the big picture. And then really getting specific about 4 areas where this kind of engagement and interest and personal growth happen. And so it took me a long time to narrow it down to this.
Yeah.
But once you do, you're telling your story of your professional journey. And this is something that anyone in almost any profession I can imagine engaging in. Really, what are the central motivations of my work? How do I crystallize that into focuses that people can understand? Who am I conveying this to, and for what purpose? And the images, are really about, and I usually choose one kind of genre of image, so just photographs or just illustrations. But in this one, I combine them because I wanted to encourage people to use the image to think about the work for themselves. And these images felt like they allowed for that. So that's kind of how this came about. And, I remember at the conference last summer, we had a person from the medical field. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that person and storyboards and how helpful that would have been for her. So yeah.
So the conference that Michelle is referring to is the Habits of Mind conference that happened last April in Vista, California. And the second annual Habits of Mind conference is taking place in Rochester, New York. So if you're interested interested in that information, that will be in the comments as well as part of the show notes around this episode. But I think the opportunity, as you're starting to lean into that, Michelle, of starting to see the impact that storyboards have from like a priority, and thinking through whether I'm talking to adults as part of a leadership organization outside of school, so in the medical field, or something that's directly correlated to staff development that curriculum directors are designing on behalf of their own faculty, or it's something from a staff perspective that they're designing for students. I think the opportunity that I really do want to lean in is really paying attention to what the focus, as I continue to study this, is trying to capture. It's not just describing the content territory. So from a differentiation point of view, you can see that as like an example, thinking about looking at exploration of the purposes and facets of differentiation. But there's also a related action. And I think the related action is so helpful for folks to see, not just one unit at a time, but across the board, of what kind of learning experience might this be? So I have that frame of reference, but what do I get to experience? What do I get to do? How is it actually something that not just I can take away with in terms of like collecting stuff? It's really the application orientation, which you have crystallized so nicely toward the end of each of those focus statements.
Well, and one of the things that's interesting too, and this is something I learned last summer when I did a Habits of Mind conference, a workshop with some teachers, was that each one of these could also be storyboarded.
Yeah.
So I could take each one of these focal points and then drill in and develop a storyboard for each of them. So they are connected up here, and then how do they play out here?
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that in a way, from a metacognitive perspective, it helps you to be thinking about not only the biggest picture, but then you start moving it down, just as Allison was suggesting. As you think about the actions and the things you expect people to do, you keep narrowing it down, and everything, once you're in a storytelling mode, it becomes a way of sort of imagining where you're going and what you're going to do. What interests me is when you're talking, Michelle, one of the things that I heard you kind of really reflecting on was it sort of forced you to tell the story to yourself first. That in a way you were saying, what's important to me? Why? And something about, I've noticed this with many people when I've worked with storyboarding, once you are catalyzing the passion for why you really want to tell this story.
Right.
Like, there's something that is motivating about that. I really want you to understand my story because I feel this is important. Sort of gets you into the mode of really telling the story. Then with the hope, if you're thinking of the actions, with the hope of how the people you affect and influence want to tell their own story as a result of what they've done.
That is right. I was thinking about that too. The levels to which this goes and where it goes it's infinite, really.
Now, we just have our first comment from Anila, and she's asking the question: can storyboards be used in any discipline? Absolutely. I mean, it's designed to be a frame in which there's value in giving people clarity as to the road that they are going to be embarking on, but at the same time to start to think through the idea of how it can continue to inspire deeper learning or new learning along the way. So the impact is that it's not just something that the teacher is administering or the professional developer is administering to the workshop participants. The idea is that there's a level of vitality and freshness, because the opportunity for learners to actually see, here's an area of interest or fascination that I want to go after more deeply, or they have opportunities to periodically consolidate and reflect as part of their learning journey as well. Bena, can you talk a little bit of why reflecting along the learning journey for the learners is so fundamentally important?
You're asking me, or are you asking Michelle?
I'm asking you.
Bena.
No, I'm asking you, Bena, first.
Oh. I think it's, to me, I mean, if this is a form of communication, I've had my years of storytelling, so I'm a storyteller. And I always want to know, what impact has it have on you? Because just telling the story, it becomes just, it has to be that you're communicating. It isn't just a personal reflection that says, oh, this is such interesting material. It says, this is interesting material. Tell me what you think. So I think it's always asking whoever is the audience to the story, tell me what you think. Why is this important to you? And I think the more we include students as reflecting on the story, and perhaps telling us a story from the stories that's totally their own perspective, how rich can that be? And how much can that affect how we understand even what we're doing and the impact it's having? But Michelle, I know you are very much a strong believer in that.
Yes.
Maybe you can speak to some of your experience with it.
Yeah, well, actually, I think back to that workshop in Pennsylvania at the World of Learning, and I think to the Spanish teacher who,
Olivia,
completely rethought how to teach Spanish based on reflecting on the year that she spent in Guatemala and how she actually learned Spanish and the process she went through. And so then her storyboard became an adventure learning to speak Spanish.
Right.
And she reversed so many of the protocols that we typically see in a second language class.
Yeah.
And I saw that with so many of the teachers who were at the workshop. And doing this now with a school in North Greenbush, I am seeing this with the teachers as well, that they are having this opportunity to step back, look at what they do, look at their discipline, and really think about how development plays into that, how technique plays into that, for example, in art or in music, how skill plays into that in mathematics or writing. So the layers, they begin to really see the interconnectedness in the layers, and then sequence it in a way that they can convey this to a child, they can convey this to a parent, they can convey this to someone who's not an education person, because we veer away from edu-speak in these storyboards. So yeah, it's the reflection piece is at so many levels.
Yeah. So Mari is giving a shout out. Love your work. So again, whether it's Michelle, Bena, myself, or a combination of all of us, I think that's great. So thank you for joining in and participating.
Thank you,
live.
Mari.
So we take your compliment as a collective idea.
So I think, it's interesting to explore this. While we're talking about it, Michelle, could you start shifting? The one thing that I think is interesting is that you started to address a question that we hear so often in the habits of mind world. So I'm just going to shift us into that for a moment, because I think it's another great example of how you were able to use that as a catalyst or as a jumping point. So the question is always, well, there are 16 habits in the habits of mind. which ones should I choose to use and how would I make those choices? And people ask that all the time. And you decided, well, why don't I tell that as a story rather than trying to, explain that in a lot of different ways? So you created this very interesting storyboard.
Yeah. So, it was something that I saw in my my work with teachers, through the Teacher Center, as we began to explore things like how to make effective learning transparent, and how the habits can help you to do that. And the course was called Teaching with an Open Hand, and I began to talk developmentally with them about it. And then when we decided to do the playbook, I really drilled into that and thought about developmentally, how are these habits playing out? What do we know about the different developmental stages that that inform our choices about what we're going to include in the classroom? And so wonder and awe is something that comes very naturally to young children. It's something that we can amplify as a habit of mind in an early childhood classroom. Whereas thinking about your thinking is a developmental breakthrough that takes place as kids move into adolescence. And while they may be able to do it in certain ways when they're younger, it becomes a real thing when they move through adolescence and their brain goes through all the changes that it goes through. So thinking about your thinking is something you want to cultivate and amplify for young adults, young teenagers through young adults, as they develop their executive functions. Is there a way to scroll up a little bit on this?
Hold on one second. Chrissy, if you can give me an assistance, that would be great.
And so we really thought about, what are the habits of mind that really appropriately can be introduced and reinforced at each stage. And so learning through all the gathering data through all the senses, remaining open to continuous learning, questioning and posing problems. Young children are doing that all the time, asking the question why. Whereas creating and innovating is really, in a conscious way, something they start to do a little bit older. Thinking interdependently is something they start to do in groups, not only playing together, but working together, learning together. Understanding, listening with empathy and understanding is something that they can do in middle childhood, that they can start to be taught the actions of empathy. And they have some past knowledge now to apply. So they can begin to think about, how did that work out when I did this last time? Was it good, or did it work for me, or was it not so great? And we can help them to use applying past knowledge to make choices, which then carries them through. So that's the kind of thing that I began to think about as I thought about developmental benchmarks. And it made it much more possible for teachers to make some choices.
So I just was trying to get you to talk a little bit about the idea that who were you telling the story to, and how would that really relate to the way students might read the story?
Yeah, so that's interesting because this was really written for teachers.
Okay.
And whereas the professional development storyboard was written for more coordinators and leaders and so on and so forth. This is really written for teachers. This whole playbook is really written for teachers. And so I'm using language that I used in the classroom as a teacher for many years, that I know plays to the things that teachers think about. And that is, how do I integrate this? How do I make this part of what I do?
Mm-hmm.
Not a standalone, separate curriculum, because we don't need any more curriculum in the classroom. We need approaches that we can integrate throughout our work with kids. So that's what I was thinking about when I wrote this. And I was also thinking about, for kids, how could teachers begin to talk about these habits with their students?
So when you keep referencing the playbook, and I'm not sure anybody knows what the playbook is, so I want to just make sure. So you're talking about a publication, but I want you to talk about it. You know, first you can certainly say something briefly about it, or we can put it in the chat how you can see this playbook, get this playbook. But what I'm interested in is, this seems to be almost a table of contents. It's almost like saying, here's what you're going to be able to see. If you're looking for developmentally middle school kids, you're going to find information about this and this. So in a way, if you're thinking about this, I was just thinking you could do this with any textbook that you were going to be using. Is you could really think about what jumps out. What do you want to jump out in it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Just talk about that a little.
It is a way of crystallizing, again, the essential points of anything you write. The storyboard is as much a wonderful way of conveying human development as it is conveying story development,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or text development, because it helps you as the author and the reader a way of understanding how things play out and how things are connected. What ideas are running through the text as a stream, and which ideas stand independently as ideas. And it was a very helpful, I think it was one of the first things we did, actually, when we started the playbook, right?
Yep. And it was lovely to spend some time with Michelle in just giving her some feedback on the storyboards as a frame for the playbook. And to me, one of the important parts that helps me see as a classroom teacher as to what's my part in this learning journey. So I can gauge myself based on the developmental level as well as my subject area expertise, and begin to pay attention to the idea that learning is a collective endeavor that's inspired by the students in front of you, but also the stories that were told in the years before they showed up into your classroom, and the stories that will be continuing to be told after they leave your classroom space as well. So I think that's the dynamic and the beauty as to what this storyboard does, both crystallizing my location within this roadmap, as well as how I am part of the journey with my colleagues and my learners to grow thoughtful behaviors, dispositions, and related actions.
Yeah. And, if you think, like, my whole thing is thinking about the curriculum as a river, right? And this is development is such a clear example of how the learning journey is really a river, and what came before us and what's coming after us is so important.
So when you've been using storyboards as part of your own professional development practice, what's the impact it's been having on the audiences that you're working with?
So, I have had a really wonderful time working with a faculty on first looking at the continuum of learning as a whole in the school. And then once they have seen the continuum, being able to then drill into what they do, knowing where they are on that river. They're able then to really crystallize what their year is like in their discipline or their several disciplines, to really identify what's most important because the group has thought that through together. What they want to highlight based on the mission of the school, the imperatives of that year, so on and so forth. When they're in dialogue with each other, and we saw this at that conference, right? When that group came together,
Right.
they were so effective with each other because they were talking not only about their particular thing, but how their particular thing fits into the bigger picture of their school. So that's what's happening.
Yeah, and you've done a beautiful job clarifying that from a design perspective, but let's talk about from a participant perspective. So when they have had the opportunity of being given these advanced organizers, can you talk a little bit about how it's actually impacted the learning experience from start to finish?
I can't talk about that quite yet because we're not quite at the end of the road yet. But what I can say is that where those teachers and providers who have done their curriculum storyboards and are using them, particularly I can think of one person who is a school counselor who did a storyboard for her year with groups of students, and she sat with them and talked with them about what it is that she wrote and does this capture everything that they do. So it became a dialogue, not only in terms of conveying to them the interconnectedness of what happens in groups in school counseling and also in the classroom, but also it gave them some voice as to what was missing and what was important to them. And she was really kind of blown away by that. So that conversation is really powerful. When you're done with your curriculum storyboard, to then sit with a class who's really had you for a little while and talk about, does this convey what we wanted to, what's real? And so that's helpful too.
And one of the things, as you're clarifying that, Michelle, storyboards are designed to not just impact the agency of the designers, but it's also impacting the agency of the learners that are privileged to be part of that learning journey with you. So the notion, when we have students actively investigate and share and reflect, they are actually demonstrating that we've sort of moved from this being the teacher or the curriculum design team story to my story or to our story. And so it changes because of that learning experience that is a shared moment in time, which may or may not be replicable from, period 2 to period 3, because it's a different group of learners that may be inspired and sort of thinking about things in a little bit of a different direction. So I think that to me is the power of curriculum storyboards as it's designed to be used, because one of the things that Heidi Hayes Jacobs and I continue to make sure when we're sharing these ideas with folks around the world, that they are seeing this not just as something as a classroom wall art or something that's handed out to families or they are handing out to students. It's designed to be made sense of. And that kind of integration as part of the instructional experience continues to breathe life and vibrancy in the learning journey.
Well, and at a practical level, you know, at my last administrative position, we had a very complicated method for mapping curriculum, and it was really complicated in terms of what it was asking teachers to convey, and then on the other hand, it did not show the interconnectedness. And so one of the things about storyboards that is also just on a practical level so helpful is that it is not daunting to go back in and revise to keep it real, you know? And that, I think, is such a blessing, you know, because we used to do curriculum review in the summer, and it was, you know, it just felt like a dogged task.
So. Absolutely. And I think it adds a level of freshness and vitality in the process. Yes. And also starting to think about that kind of iterative design of how we're continuing to be inspired by new ideas that were born out of the learning experience that was happening. And how can we potentially step back and think about what should be reflected in the next iterative try when we go after this again.
You know, it's another interesting thing that I just thought of too, is that one of the things that I've noticed is that school leaders start to see how well they have conveyed the priorities and mission and philosophy and tenets of the school in how the storyboards are expressed. So then that becomes a conversation as well, is, you know, well, what makes us us? And is that conveyed in these? How do we better convey what makes us us in these storyboards? So that is also true, is that the learning at the leadership level is also pretty powerful.
And the community level.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Who are we as a school community, and how is that reflected in the stories we tell? And this is as true when we're thinking about attracting students or teachers to our school, but
that's also, right.
It's really part of the kind of feeling we want to be known for in every single classroom and every single point of contact. So I think it's a beautiful way of rounding out this conversation.
Yes.
So Bena, as you started to listen in on this last part of the conversation around the desired impact we're hoping it is having for the learners, any other last reflections on your part in that regard?
You know, I think it's, you know, I think we've really explored it. I feel so strongly we need to continue to explore it. Because to me, it's the interesting thing when Michelle was using the metaphor of the river, I was thinking, but the river keeps running.
Yeah.
It doesn't stop. It's not like a pond that's sitting there stagnant. And so the idea that this is something that has a vitality, but the only way we will ever understand that vitality is when we see how people step into the river and what they leave with, and hopefully that they don't sink when they go down in a little canoe, because they're kind of rowing along, trying to understand it, and that it'll be a beautiful way for them to also have a record of what's the journey that they took that year. I could see students leaving with a storyboard that was all annotated and figured out when we did this and when we were here, or my notes and my reflection, because it's really, in a way, the storyboard is not only an artifact for the school, but it's an artifact for the memory, And
Yeah.
I think that that would be a lovely way to think about it as well.
Yeah.
So we have one final question coming in from Anne on LinkedIn. I'm wondering how this process can be used to reinterpret and streamline a package program or curriculum at school.
Mm.
And the package includes far more material that can be covered in the classroom. So this is such a powerful question, and it's something that I'm sure Michelle has encountered in some of the work that she's doing, as well as some of the work from a curriculum consultant that I'm doing. The opportunity of thinking about any kind of packaged curriculum, I think my first point of guidance would be that you're making those thoughtful, deliberate, creative choices together as a PLC team, both horizontally and vertically. Because anytime when you have a packaged curriculum that you're sort of expected to be somewhat or significantly faithful to, any kind of choices that you're making will have a ripple effect up and down the vertical articulation. So I think that's the first piece, and from some quick advice. I think the second part is really starting to think about laying out an overview. And again, I'm thinking about, for example, Open Syed or illustrative math or wit and wisdom. Those are three concrete examples that have legs into elementary, but all the way up through secondary, where they do write overviews that are multi-paragraph treatises, but at the same time give you a bird's eye view as to what the story that's the basis of those particular curriculum modules or units. So once you lay those out horizontally, you can begin to start thinking about what are the areas of emphasis that actually are the highlight reel of this particular packaged module, and how can I grab that and begin to use some of the narrative through line of the story, making it so that it's using we instead of students, making it so that it's conversational and accessible, focusing on the areas of what students will be energized by. Those are another sort of quick round of examples that I could suggest right out of the gate. Michelle, I'm sure you've encountered this as well.
Yeah, and I would say two things. I mean, one is really actually very important, and that is that each teacher have the opportunity to really find their personal meaning in these things, because I think when we can do it like we have to do it because it's a mandate, or we can find some meaning in it for ourselves, which then enriches the way that we're delivering this curriculum. And given no choice, finding some meaning gives us a sense of choice. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that that it's also really important to think about what are the priorities of the school, and how does that overlay to the choices of what to highlight and what are the nuts, and then what's the cream on top. If you get to it, you get to it. If you don't, you don't. But what's at the heart of what it is you want to accomplish, and really thinking about that, as Allison said, from a vertical and horizontal point of view. So I would leave you with those two thoughts.
Bena, you have any response to what Anne's raising, which again is a very real and practical and something that teachers are struggling with right now?
Yeah.
We are on such programmatic overload.
Yes.
And so I've always thought that the work that you and Heidi have done on what to cut, what to keep, what is classic, what is not, is like a very fundamental conversation to have. But in one district where we're working, Allison, where we are actually doing this, one of the things that the teachers decided was, in order to make the storyboard help us tell a story that's important to our school.
Right.
We all do project-based learning, and we're going to use project-based learning as our storyboard. And that will then allow us to choose from what we're doing. And it may become more interdisciplinary, because this is an elementary school where they're saying when we do project-based learning, we can then start compacting some of the things and creating a thread. But the thread is one of projects that are meaningful, authentic, and really bring that passion to the work that they necessarily are doing programmatically to build the skills. So that's just another spin on it.
Fitting that work into a meaningful context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, Anne, hopefully we started to address the question. One of the things you can hop over to Curriculum Storyboards, see a couple more concrete examples, some of which are organized around some programmatic type curriculum documents. But you can also start to engage in the process of streamlining, which Bena mentioned a minute or two ago, the idea of what to cut back on, what to consolidate, what to keep, and what to create. Because, and I think in every curriculum, regardless of whether or not I built it from scratch on my own or all the way to the other side where I have a program or prescribed curriculum and I have way too many materials and resources, especially based on the amount of minutes or days that we have together. That is something that classroom teachers have to do regularly. That's what librarians have been doing for a couple of decades, about the conscious act of weeding things out that are no longer serving the people in front of us. But it doesn't mean that we're disposing of them. So the other opportunity of starting to think about, in this moment for this year or for this series of time, what is the most appropriate way of continuing to not just cover the curriculum, but also do so in such a way that is energizing the learners in front of us. And what we see to be most impactful based on our collective experience is that they have an opportunity to engage, to wonder, to analyze, to create. They're doing something with what they're learning. So hopefully that gives you a quick response to such a clear and powerful question. So, alrighty, well, that's all the time we have. So thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us. And again,
much pleasure.
In the comments already, the Habits of Mind playbook have been featured as a link. So if you wanted to venture into that territory, get to see the power of that playbook and the integration of habits of mind, including the storyboard, that's a fabulous opportunity. You can also join us at the Habits of Mind conference, April 7th and 8th. So again, we'll put a link in the comments down below as well. So if you're interested in having conversations with Bena, Michelle, and myself, we will all be there live and in person for 2 days. So again, thinking about the role storyboards will continue to play as part of that integrated conversation. But thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of our, at least where I am, a very cold and chilly week. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.